the purpose of today, and I want to give you a primer in terms of who Cubic is before we get into it. That should be the only time we'll mention Cubic as a company, because the whole idea behind this session is to give you guys a one-on-one session without any bias. So if there is a point where I start talking about Cubic, you can start heckle me as much as you want. I definitely don't mind it, because the idea behind this is to give you a non-biased view on location data and its efficacy into out-of-home. So kind of understanding what Cubic is. Cubic is a location intelligence company that's been in the market for about 3 years or so. And we've basically operated in digital mobile environments for a very long amount of time. And so we do audience targeting there for digital mobile advertising, to help people understand how people go to stores and the stores that they go to. We transitioned and augmented out-of-home into our stack of technology about a year ago, with Clear Channel as one of our exclusive partnerships with them in the past to help us develop new technology for everything from attribution of actually understanding people exposed to out-of-home advertising into stores, what that lift looks like, and also developing a lot of other products along the way. So we've been in the market for about a year. We've actually done a lot of tests all throughout the last year with out-of-home companies, including some people in the front, like Josh Kaner from JC&Co, people from Clear Channel, and many others throughout the industry, where there's a lot of innovation going on. But if you guys want to talk about that, like I said, we can talk about it later. Most of what we're going to be talking about today is really 3 things. The first thing is really, what is data? I know we talk about data a lot. If you listen to Kim's speech earlier in the day, she talks about big data and enormous data. What is that, right? Like literally, if you think about what data is, it's information, but how is it stored? What does it look like? All that type of stuff. I think it's super important to understand from the fundamentals what that actually is and how it's eventually used in both marketing, digital marketing, and eventually into out-of-home. Then we'll dig into location data itself. There's a lot of nuances in terms of what it is, how it works, what it isn't, what it's not, and what it can do. So we'll dive into that. And then finally, we'll apply those, the data information, the location information, into the out-of-home world and how it can apply and kind of change the way you look at and view the lens of how out-of-home can be planned, attributed, and also bought. So going into this, data in the real world. Who has ever searched on Google? Somebody did not raise their hand. You're lying. So Google, right? It's one of those things that everybody uses fundamentally every single day of their lives to find out stuff. So whether or not you're looking for a cruise vacation or anything like that, but what happens really after that is some type of data gets created. And we all understand that, right? And we've seen all those Amazon searches that we've had where that product follows you to 1,000 other pages that you go to. That data is what you're creating by searching into Google, but when you're searching into Amazon. And there's lots of different types of data points in that real world where eventually you might get retargeted by Royal Caribbean with a cruise ad because you searched for some type of cruise information in the past. It's something that we see day in, day out, but understanding what that is and how it actually gets there is pretty darn important. So fundamentally, looking at the different types of data sets that are actually out there before we even dive into location, I think is pretty important. So I'm going to dive all the way back to what data is from a demographic perspective. So if you kind of look at demographics, TV has been bought and sold on demographic for a very long amount of time. Basically, the idea behind it has been, if you watch The Walking Dead, you're more than likely a male adult, from 18 to 34, or whatever that age group might end up being. Most media was transacted based on this information, and most of it was actually done through the census. That's where actually most of the data was originally stored in terms of how people understood what the people in the United States would be targeted against. So demographic information such as your male or female, your household skew, your household income, all that type, your political affiliation, all that information is done on the demographic side, and that's been bought and sold for a long period of time. But as things kind of evolved, more and more data became possible. So beyond just understanding whether or not you're male 25 to 34, which is a very broad swath of people, I know my interests are very different than probably a lot of other people within the same age bracket in the room. That kind of shifted over to that third guy, which is the psychographic guy, which is understanding things like behavioral understanding or interest of what you're actually doing. So the idea behind it is simple, right? You're moving from this I'm a male, 25 to 34, to I'm a male 25 to 34 who also enjoys sports, right? And so the idea of being able to target psychographic things like somebody that visits ESPN consistently and looks at basketball content more than likely makes them a basketball fan. And so now if you're a sport or some type of affiliation with the NCAA March Madness or NBA, you have a reason to target this person as opposed to just buying ESPN just because it's males 25 to 34. Then there's another step in this kind of evolution in terms of data and how it's been used for marketing, and it's social. Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest. There's a lot of user-generated content, and user-generated content is basically anything that you tweet, you like, you share. All that information is basically created by you to tell people what you like, right? Because the things that you follow, you're not going to follow 10 hip-hop stars or hip-hop artists if you don't like hip-hop. So things like that happen in the social world that gives a better indication of your interest, not only in general of hip-hop, but also potentially what's in the news today and what's kind of happening in real time via Twitter feeds and things like that. And social has been a real big indicator of interest and psychographic targeting and data targeting. We're obviously all in the room very well aware of what Facebook's been doing. But that in general has brought a new type of data into these assets. But all of that was done online, right? Whether it's on your mobile device or whether or not it's on your desktop device, all of that is online-based media. The problem with that and kind of how we can operate in the world, specifically for out of home, but kind of in how consumers act in general, is most things that you do are probably in the real world. Most of us are spending time at our computers working and things like that, but the things that you're actually doing, whether it's taking your kids to school, whether or not it's going to the soccer field, whether or not it's shopping at a mall, those are happening in the real world. And so all those online indicators don't necessarily tell you what's happening with with what you're doing as a person outside of what you're doing online on social feeds and things like that. And so the idea behind it now is using location or geographical data to take that to the next step where 92% of almost all purchases in America still happen in person. So almost everything that you do happens with you going somewhere. So all the things that we're talking about in terms of Amazon and all the kind of e-commerce retailers and the shift to e-commerce is 8% of all spend in the United States. Everything else still happens in a mall, despite the fact that it seems like lots of businesses are going out of business in retail. This is a stat directly from the Census Bureau in 2017 that basically tells you that regardless of all of our perceptions of where spend is, everything is still happening in the real world. And so being able to link anything that you're doing with a consumer back to some type of real world event, whether it's a visit to a store, whether or not it's transactional data via a credit card that you're using, or whether or not it's a purchase on your loyalty program on your supermarket card, all those things make a huge difference in terms of our ability to understand whether or not the advertising itself has been effective. And so this take and this kind of new understanding of the past really indicates how we can use this out-of-home information and location information in conjunction together to make a difference in the future and how we look at how out-of-home is being bought and sold as well as planned for. But before we kind of get into it, this also has a lot less to do with location data as well, but data collection really matters, right? Because the idea behind data collection and having good data really means a lot. And so if you look at the online world, so we can talk, there's a lot of buzzwords in the online digital world. About 50% of the ads that are being targeted against male and female genders are wrong. So if you look at the population, about 50% are female and about 50% are male. So basically you can throw a dart on the wall and be just as accurate as trying to target. So if you have a bad methodology, then you're going to be off a lot of the times. And so if you're off a lot of the times, that methodology becomes a huge problem. A good example is if you kind of think about how maps work, right? If you look at a map and you kind of visualize it in your head, actually, let's take a step back. You remember those projectors that have that like little light bulb that's on top, and then you kind of press it on, and then you'd have a little transparency sheet of paper on it? So let's have a transparent map. If you were to put a pen in the middle of that map, right, and let's just say you were to pinpoint Austin, you'd be able to circle around and put a star around it. But if you were to shift it over just a little bit, and that pen had to stay in place, you'd be in another city. You could be in another state. And so understanding that type of data when it comes to merging the understanding of where that pen is to where Austin actually is are two separate things. And so by understanding that, the way data is collected makes a huge difference in your ability to understand whether or not the location data, and we're about to transition to location data in a second, is actually real. Because if you're just off by, let's say, 100 feet, and your mapping is completely off, you can't actually do anything right, because anything that's outside of the 100 feet will not fall into a McDonald's, will not fall into a mall, will not fall into, you might end up in a river, if you're on a bridge, and that information might be completely inaccurate. And when it's inaccurate, you'll have improper results. So, does anybody know what this is? Lat long, right? Where is it? No idea? You shouldn't, because this is literally, so when I ask what data is, this is what data literally is. It's just a number of strings somewhere, and someone needs to decode it to make sense of it. So that is a lat long, but where it is actually in the middle of Times Square. And this is the information that is needed from a lat long perspective to finally put it to Times Square. But like I said earlier, if you map it incorrectly, what happens? You could be anywhere, right? And if you're 100 meters off or you're 5 meters off, you're completely in a different place, and that data just isn't done very well. And so when you're talking about location, there's actually two aspects of it, and I think before moving on to anything else, understanding those two different aspects makes a big difference in terms of whether or not you can move forward and feel comfortable about how location data works. So you have one side, which is that lat long data that gentleman identified over there. And then on the bottom is obviously the visualization of it, or that mapping of where a point of interest is or place. And a point of interest could be literally anything. It could be a billboard, it could be a bus shelter, it could be a McDonald's, it could be a mall, it could be a state, it could be a DMA. It's really up to you in terms of what you guys are looking at, but mapping that specific point and that lat long to a certain place is one of the most fundamental challenges to kind of location data. Because if you're off by just a little bit, it doesn't make any sense anymore. And one of those decimal points move over a little bit, it doesn't make sense anymore. And so all these things play a huge factor in terms of our ability to understand location data and its efficacy for everything from out of home to digital to mobile. And so while we can talk about all day about how amazing the application of this data is, the ability to do these two things is actually one of the most oddly hardest things you can do, because the data itself, I'll transparently say this out loud. The data itself is a little imperfect. It's a lot imperfect many times. And the mapping technology behind it a lot of times is also imperfect. If you have the wrong address, it's not a right place, right? So if a store closes down, a good example of that is, let's just say you have a shopping center, and one of the stores closes down, and you still identify that as Home Depot, but it's no longer there. You'll still see lots of visits to this Home Depot because the mapping tells me that there's people going there, but it could be a completely new store altogether, and it became a Lowe's because Lowe's bought them out. So those fundamentally change the calculus in terms of how you can understand where location data is. So you have all this data hitting this one spot, but if the point of interest is wrong, it really doesn't matter, right? Because there's really no people going to Home Depot because the Home Depot does not exist. So looking at location data, this is where things get a little hairy because there's a lot of information that I'm about to throw at you, and a lot of key terms that if you guys don't know, tell me you don't know it, and I can explain it a little further. I know that guy told you to hold questions till the end, but I think this is super important in terms of fundamentals. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So there's lots of different sources of location data, and there are actually more beyond this, but I would say that from a usability perspective, this is where things sit. Has anyone used, let's say Google Maps, Foursquare, Placed, any of those types of, I assume everybody, right? I hope so. So most consumer apps that use location data or have endemic information with location is how those apps exist. And what those apps allow you to do is, as you're using it, so whether or not you're using Yelp, whether or not you're using Foursquare, you can use those types of apps, and they're taking your location data as you're using it, right? Because you're trying to look for places to eat, you're looking for places to shop and things like that. You're looking for navigation paths via Google Maps. And so those consumer apps generate lots and lots of location data. Kind of going back to how Facebook and Google operate, most consumers, about 100 million consumers in the United States use a Facebook app. I don't know what the stat is for Google Maps, but there's lots of people that use it, but most of that data falls behind the walled gardens. Google doesn't let that out ever, and no one has access to it except for Google. Same thing with Facebook, and hopefully, honestly, their scale is so big that it really doesn't go out of their ecosystem. But these consumer apps are where a lot of great data gets generated. Unfortunately, most of it is not accessible to the people in this room to use for planning or buying because Facebook and Google just won't allow for it. And so some of the more, some of the larger apps that are out there for consumer apps might be something like a Gas Buddy. I don't know if you guys use Gas Buddy or Foursquare. Or even Place, and Place is actually known to do some of the things that we were talking about earlier. I don't know if anyone uses that app either in here. Next thing is the telcos. Has anyone here heard of the Serial podcast? I'm sure people have probably heard of it. So the Serial podcast is super interesting in that it really tells you that location data from telecommunications, so Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, Sprint, those are your major ones in the United States, their data is actually based on these cell towers. And that's what's actually been used and powered a lot of what Geopath was doing before a lot of the announcements today with Streetlytics and things like that. That data was basically used at a wide scale, and there's a lot of issues with it when it comes down to understanding actual roadway patterns and how people move and things like that, because the radius that people have a margin of error for a lot of the telecommunication-based location data is about a mile wide in terms of radius. So it's a huge margin of error, and that's only in the right conditions where you basically have a wide open field and the towers are close together. In other urban areas where signals get obfuscated and things like that, telcos become really, really hard to operate with. And so that's why there's a huge transition from a lot of telecommunication-based or carrier-based data into GPS-based data from cell phone devices and other types of devices. Third, ad calls. You guys receive ads on a daily basis on your mobile devices. Almost every single one of those ad calls have some type of location data attached to it, which I think is interesting. Most of it is not usable because a lot of it is spoofed, a lot of it is made up. There's a lot of articles on Adweek and other information about that. Ad calls are going to be very interesting in that it's the only way to provide scale, but also it's also very little data because you need to receive ads at very certain time periods of the day for us to actually ascertain something. So typically if you're going to Target or anything like that, unless you pull out your phone, you receive an ad on a specific app, that data isn't being captured in the ad call. And then finally there's something called the SDK, which is a software development kit. The SDK goes into apps. It's basically a little mini application that goes into other apps that use location data. This has, actually I'm going to go to the next slide. So over here is basically where the pros and cons of each one are. The idea behind it is consumer apps have a lot of high quality. It's not as scalable, mainly because it's a business to consumer app. If it's a business to consumer app, that means you have to maintain a user base and maintain a lot of other things within it to be able to scale it out properly. And so a lot of these apps are really stuck in the low millions because getting more than Facebook or Google is just extremely hard. Telecommunications are awesome in terms of persistence. Every single time your phone is pinging a cell tower, that's information that they're getting. So every 15, 20, 30 seconds, telecommunication companies are getting it. The problem is the low precision on it is pretty poor. And so while it's great to understand if people are within a city or a DMA or a state, it's not necessarily great to understand what movement patterns are their pathways that they're taking to get certain places, if they're walking, if they're driving, or even if they're spending time in a store. Third, digital and mobile ad calls are super simple. Almost everybody receives advertising, so the ability to scale out that location data is really, really good, right? Your ability to have lots and lots of data on many, many users is there. The problem is the density of data or the amount of data per person or per day is very minimal because unless you hit the exact amount of, there's a lot of complications with it, but unless you hit the exact amount of bidding and winning a bid and having someone on downstream being able to understand that data, that's not fraudulent because all the ad stream based data is also subject to a lot of the fraud and viewability issues and all that type of stuff that happen in advertising in general. It becomes a little hard. Finally, there's the SDK, which has a lot of the same things that the consumer apps have. The problem is that it's also very hard to scale. Most apps don't want a foreign invader inside their own app because it can cause crashing. It can cause a lot of different things within the apps that they're using that, because it's a little mini kind of program that runs on its own, and that might be an issue. And so while it's great in terms of an ability to, it's kind of a middle ground between the ad call scalability and the consumer app scalability, but it still has a lot of issues because most people are not willing to integrate what's an SDK into their own apps most of the time. With 5 minutes left, I'm going to run through a lot of this really quickly. So there's one major thing that I do want to talk about, and it's the idea of persistent data. This matters more than anything in the out-of-home space, because I might not have time to go to my key takeaway slide. I would say the number one thing for out-of-home, if you're going to analyze anything about location data, is persistence of that data. The reason why is if you don't have persistent data or a complete understanding of how people got somewhere, there's no way for you to understand how or if someone was exposed to an out-of-home ad. And the reason for that is because you have, your ad's only going to face one way. And so if someone's moving in this direction, how do that's the only person that can see it. If someone's moving in the other direction, it's impossible to see. Other things to take into consideration are things like speed. Without persistent data, you're not going to understand how fast people are traveling, right? Because if you think about it, a lot of times you might have an out-of-home billboard, on the freeway that's over here, but also an out-of-home board that's over here. And the margin of error, in all honesty, when it comes to location data, is too high to really differentiate the two. And so understanding speed makes a difference because if someone's walking, then more than likely they're going to be on a sidewalk, and that's more than likely the ad that they saw. Whereas if if their speed is fast and over 25 miles per hour, the chances of them being on a motor vehicle are much higher. And so that ad on that freeway is probably the one they saw instead. So all these things kind of come into combination for out-of-home exposures, and using that data to overlay against where your billboards are, which is the point of interest or the mapping, and that location data that's being mapped onto it to figure out if someone was exposed to some type of advertising. The second thing that we've done quite a bit in general is using these location data points to understand visitation. So what I talked about earlier is the ability to take some of these out-of-home exposures and actually figure out and link whether or not that created a real-world event. So a lot of tier 2 advertisers, like auto dealerships, really covet the ability to understand whether or not someone eventually visited their dealership. Without that type of information, it becomes extremely difficult for them to legitimize their ad spend in out-of-home. Whereas, in digital and online, you can actually understand how many people are asking for quotes and how many people are building their own prices, how many people eventually go to store because of bringing that piece of paper in terms of the quote that they got. So the ability of using this in out-of-home has a huge implication from now I have this out-of-home exposure into the actual real-world place, and that is a way to finally link a lot of what's been happening, and we've been talking about the effectiveness of out-of-home, being able to drive people to do things with the constant reminders and being able to have huge impact on actual KPI performers that you've never been able to measure before. And so things like that become super important. So whether or not it's a QSR like McDonald's or Wendy's, which there was a session earlier about that and being able to drive this way, all this type of information becomes really big and something that you should definitely start looking at. Talked about this really quickly. I'm going to actually skip this, but part of this, looking at that last one, analyzing travel paths, I believe it's also something that Geopath is releasing as part of their beta. If you haven't looked at it, it looks pretty darn cool, so have a look at it. So going to the three things that out-of-home is using location data for. The first thing is analytics, so this is the board planning or indexing, and its ability to understand a lot of that board that doesn't usually get bought by somebody, what are the characteristics of the people that pass by it? It's not something you can easily answer without location data, but with location data, I can tie it back to a specific device and understand those visit patterns of that device, as well as other types of places that they go, things that they click on. So that's super important. Looking at attribution, I just explained earlier with kind of understanding, kind of going to the store. But also on top of that, there's ability to link that back to transactional data. So if you work with somebody like a MasterCard or a Visa, being able to take that data and actually take that to real-world transaction events beyond just the visitation event, being able to take that information and use it for TV tune-in, which I think is interesting, something that Josh and I worked on sitting up here in the front. Several months ago, and then finally audiences as well. Being able to actually understand, at 1 p.m. the chances of somebody passing by this billboard is going to be highly effective for sending somebody to Wendy's or QSR, because at 1 p.m. is when people start making those decisions later on in the day. Whatever that ends up being, these audiences are a huge way of understanding how to do things in out-of-home. The next couple things are things that I want you guys to take into account when you're looking at measurement. Scale, accuracy, density, and privacy. Those first three I kind of talked about all throughout the presentation, but I think number 4 is super important, especially as we kind of go into the GDPR world, which I believe is going to translate into a lot of different policy changes within the United States. Privacy with Cambridge Analytica and Facebook and all that type of stuff is something that we need to look at very, very closely. And how people source their data, where it comes from, if there's informed consent, whether or not there's opt-out, all that information is super important to whether or not the person you're working with or the company you're working with is actually a legitimate company to be working with and safe to work with. Because the stakes are pretty high right now, because if you get PR problems, you might as well just not do it. And then so looking at privacy, transparency I think is going to be the number 1 thing over here. Having a partner that's willing to dictate exactly what what you're sharing with you, exactly what they're willing to share, what they're able to do, how they do it, all those things are super important. Most things are done anonymously anyway, so a lot of that data is pretty safe, but still understanding that way of how they gather data and that information that they receive, and the ability to opt out, even more importantly, after they have that data is important. Rights protection and also certifications from a lot of boards, so whether or not it's working with Trustee or the NAI, which is a digital-based kind of company. And we also work with people like the FCC and FTC to make sure a lot of the things that people are doing are also kind of kosher with the ability to gather and store that data, even more so in the EU. I'm just going to leave this slide up because I already ran over, and I will be taking question and answers or questions. Unless you have an answer for me.
Yeah, if anybody has questions, I'll bring around a mic and just stand up if you have a question.
Thanks. My question relates to visitation and measuring that. Is that just a foot traffic study? Is there any other way to do it?
So the quick answer is yes. It's a foot traffic study. But it's a foot traffic study based on out-of-home. The methodology behind it, I think, is the most important thing. Because when you're looking at out-of-home, the hardest thing to ascertain is who is passing by my billboard at this time, and taking that log file information and putting it somewhere that can be used. So the methodology, I think, behind that is extremely important to vet out as you're looking at foot traffic, because transparently, foot traffic has been something that's happened in digital mobile for like the last 5 or 6 years, and it's made a pretty big stronghold in terms of how advertisers and marketers look at their digital and mobile spend. Out-of-home's been kind of left out of the dark in a lot of that. One of the things that one of the conversations that's like stuck out in my mind over the last like 5 months or so was at the very beginning of this year. I talked to Michael Lieberman, who is I guess he's a co-CEO of Kinetic now. They've been stagnant at 4% spend for a really long amount of time in terms of media ownership and things like that. And so he basically said, if I can get to 4.15, 4.25, 4.5%, it's a huge win across the board. And I don't really care how I get there, because he also needs to legitimize himself against kind of all the other spend that's happening. And so while it's just footfall, it's also much more than just footfall, because now you can take a lot of this data and go back to those same marketers and go, you know what, we're driving 2 times the value of any digital spend that you're doing. We're doing 10 times more here, 3 times less here, whatever that ends up being. Now you have an empirical data point on the same ground as basically anything else that marketer is doing. So that's a huge story. So while at the end of the day, it's location data and it's measurement and kind of methodology are up to you to decide, its story and its ability to link back to basically anything else a marketer is doing is fundamental to really the future of how we're going to be transacting over the next several years, and the underpinnings of that are starting today.
Any other questions?
Hi, Lawrence. Could you expand on point 4?
Yes, I know why you're asking that question. Out of home. So part of that is really the idea of being able to use exposure-based data to out of home and translating that and connecting that to other forms of media. And so one of those abilities is, let's just say you're somebody passing by a McDonald's ad, right? And now I have an ability to understand that this device passed by. I can take that device and go, all right, sequentially, if I market them some type of coupon from McDonald's, there's a chance that, I hit them once with out of home. Now I hit them with a coupon in the future on their mobile device or their web or their computer, and being able to take that information and now tie it together. Now I have this out of home exposure plus mobile exposure plus a digital exposure. What are the chances of this person going to my McDonald's versus somebody that was only exposed to out of home or somebody that was just exposed to mobile? Those are things you wouldn't be able to do in the past or measure in the past. And now with this type of log file or this type of exposure information based on device IDs or mobile advertising IDs, you now can tie it all into one form of, it's the same common language. And that common language, whether or not you're expanding your out-of-home budget as an advertiser into digital and kind of vice versa as a media owner trying to sell more of your out-of-home data into, out-of-home placements plus mobile / whatever digital inventory you guys have, it's really a great way to start expanding gross kind of, potentially budgets into other things that you wouldn't think about initially.
We had a question here first.
That's okay, go ahead. So I was just going to ask, I realize Google has a lot of data, but if you're not large enough as a vendor to work with Google and you're trying to evaluate DSPs and other digital companies, is there a source you recommend that allows users to go and compare, okay, are they up to date on their data? Are they employing all the privacy policies they should be? How do you evaluate when there's 1,000 companies?
You
in the
literally
space?
asked the hardest question you could possibly ask. It's really hard, and I mean that in a non-facetious way. It's everyone has a lot of marketing speak, and getting through the marketing speak becomes very, very difficult over time. I think I was in the Wendy session a little earlier. A lot of it is just me test and learn initially. Unfortunately, I think there's going to be a lot of things that you're going to realize very quickly because some of it's, as soon as you get a report back, you're going to be like, this doesn't make any fucking sense. And that happens a lot. And we know that because we hear it a lot. And as soon as that happens, you kind of need to go somewhere else. Obviously, talking to your peers and things like that would be a good resource. There's a lot of white papers available from the OAAA as well as Geopath. A lot of the companies themselves also release white papers, and so as you're doing research into it, a lot of those white papers are indicators in terms of how they operate and things like that. So, that's definitely a resource I would go to. And a lot of times, to be honest, there's a lot of thought leaders in the space as well, specifically in out-of-home, that are really trying to hone down on who the vendors are and what they might be to create standards and things like that. And I think Geopath is a really great place, but also the media owners themselves. A lot of times will have some type of purview into it because at the end of the day, it's their media that's being measured, and they have definitely a reason to actually vet out who's good and who's bad.
I guess my question is more sort of a comment, which is some of the experiences that we've had as an agency with some of the providers, what you were speaking to before about accuracy, consistency, and things like that, and frankly, sometimes taking a look at something and saying just that this doesn't really make any sense. Can you speak to, like, let's say you had $10,000 and you were a QSR or a mom and pop shop with a few locations. Do you have the confidence that you could actually move the needle on sort of down to that sort of scale, or there needs to be a certain amount of scale to be able to deliver accurately?
I'm going to go with the latter, and I actually do want to caution against kind of like fairy tales. At the end of the day, we all kind of have a pretty, maybe not everyone knows stats, but everyone has fundamentals of stats. Measurement is one of those things where most of it is based on some type of correlation, some type of confidence level, some type of something around it to have some type of future event, where you can get learnings from. The problem with something in that scenario with $10,000, not really the $10,000 part, but really the scale that we're talking about. If you're a mom and pop shop, forget the media spend. How many people go to your store every day? 15, 20, whatever that number ends up being. How many of those are people that we're going to be able to track? 1, 2, 0? A lot of times it's 0. So not having that type of information and not having, basically, if you're not Facebook and you're not Google, we're going to be really, really difficult to make those kind of guesses as well as kind of ascertain that. There definitely is a way to do more, but I'd say that for small mom and pop shops where there's only one specific shop that you're going to.
Like 5 or something like that.
So this is a cubic answer. This is not I'm going to preface that. We do recommend at least 5. We you know, at Cubic, we have pretty good scale. I'm not going to go more into it unless you ask me in person. But we have pretty good scale, and that scale really does allow us to do things like 5 stores. There's been times where if it's a large DMA and it's a new store opening and it's one of those places that people go visit a lot, there are still those abilities to understand, you know, whether or not out of home or digital and mobile are driving people to that new store opening. So it's still very possible, but it really has a lot to do with whether or not, you know, someone that, you know, Home Depot probably has thousands of visitors a day, right? Whereas a mom and pop shop has 10. And so understanding those differences makes a difference in terms of being able to evaluate whether or not, you know, that you can measure it. But at the end of the day, you know, that out-of-home placement or that digital placement can still be driving people. It's just hard to measure, is ultimately what I'm trying to get at.